Now, I'm very, very excited because today we have a very special guest here to support and to observe you guys watch this show and come round and see you in the workshops. He's the Unique Voice Patron, and I'm very, very pleased to announce Sir Patrick Stewart.
Thank you, Crystal. Thank you. Hello, everybody. I am supporting a young, adventurous, in a sense, experimental theatre company. A group of actors who are using theatre in ways other than simply to entertain, but to put across important statements about society and life, particularly in the way that it concerns, at times, young people. Now, domestic abuse can take all kinds of forms. It can be physical, it can be psychological, it can be financial, and has been historically an area of criminal offense, because to be violent within a relationship or within a marriage is a criminal offense. And organizations like Refuge have done a great deal to move legislation forward so that women and children who are in these situations have somewhere to go, somewhere to talk to. They have access to help, in other words. Now, why is that important to me? It is because as a 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old myself, growing up, I lived in a violent household. It was only violent at weekends and it was alcohol related, but during those critical years, I witnessed violence in my own home. And it was a very small home. I was brought up in what in Yorkshire we called a one-up, one-down. Probably hard to imagine now, but there was one room downstairs which had a door that came straight in off a yard, and there was one room upstairs. And my brother and I slept behind a partition in my parents' bedroom. There was no bathroom, no toilet. There was an outside toilet which became my library because I lived there until I was 15. And that was the place I went to read and study. And in winter, it was sometimes quite uncomfortable and dark. But during those years, all I experienced was fear and loneliness, because I was ashamed of what was happening in my house. I now know why it happened. I know that my father was a frustrated, unhappy, unsatisfied man with extraordinary talents that were not being used. But that is not an excuse for beating your wife and terrifying your children. The shame came from knowing that people knew about how we were living. And so on a Monday morning, when I walked to school, because it was only half a mile away, I would keep my head down, because I knew that within my neighborhood, because everybody lived very close together, everybody would have known what had happened. And it seemed to me at the time that it was only happening to me and not to anyone else, that I was completely alone. My brother was 5 years older than me, and he dealt with it much better than I was doing. But the shame and the disgrace, and if you can try to understand this, the sense of responsibility that I felt, as though somehow what was happening was my fault. And you learn things as a 6-year-old, 7-year-old, that 6, 7-year-olds should never have to learn. Like judging the temperature, the accelerating temperature of an argument or someone's behavior, to know exactly the moment when violence is going to happen. and judging that moment so that you can, as I tried to do, insert yourself between, in my case, my mother and my father, to try to stop the violence from happening. Well, those are situations no child should ever find him or herself in. And yet, the statistics prove that 1 in 4 women, so that ought to mean several people in this room, will be a victim of domestic abuse at some point in their lives. Now, if 1 in 4 women are affected, there are invariably children involved, as I was, which means that the chances are that there may very well be some of you here who are experiencing some of the things I experienced. Now, we grow up, and some of the scars heal. It took me years and years, decades, for me to realize that, in fact, one of the reasons why I became an actor, because I began acting when I was 12 years old. My English teacher put me in a play with grown-ups. And the very first moment that I walked onto a stage, a brightly lit stage, in front of a darkened auditorium where there were probably a couple of hundred people sitting, I found myself, I didn't know this then, all this is something that I thought about subsequently, but I knew that the stage was the safest place I'd ever been in. It was certainly safer than home. And it was safer than the playground. Because it was predictable. It was all rehearsed and worked out in advance. I knew exactly what would happen to me during those couple of hours, which may not sound much like fun, but to me that was a great relief. Also, it gave me the opportunity to be somebody else, not to be Patrick Stewart. Now, I'm really happy to be Patrick Stewart today, and I'm very pleased with my life, but I wasn't back then. So to pretend to be someone else was a big relief for me. So I hope that by my telling you this, sharing these personal things with you, will not only give you the background as to my involvement with what's happening with Unique Voice and what's happening here in your school this morning, but also that it happened to me. And I am grateful, Crystal, thank you, to have the opportunity to be able to perhaps help others by talking about